Chapter 61 The Tiniest Warriors. Ocean water was pouring through the gash in the station's outer wall. Such severe damage would sink most vessels, but not the Juggernaut. It was able to stay afloat because of its 4 engines. If the animals could stop the engines, the station would go under. But even the mightiest sea creatures were afraid of those huge spinning propeller blades. However, the ancient shark had planned for this. Reinforcements were on their way, and these creatures were so incredibly small that there was no risk of them being cut to pieces. The ancient shark's call to action had traveled by word of mouth from large animals, like whales, to medium-sized animals, like squid, to small animals, like shrimps, down to the tiniest of all ocean animals, zooplankton. What zooplankton lacked in size, they made up for in numbers. Billions of them were coming to help. They floated on currents and clung to other creatures and wiggled their little limbs to move through the water, and they gradually made their way to the mining station. Many zooplanktons emitted a soft blue glow, and as their tiny glowing bodies gathered together, they became a glowing haze. More zooplanktons joined, and the glowing haze became a glowing cloud, which became a glowing storm. It was sunset when Ross noticed that the sea was aglow, and she knew the ocean's tiniest warriors had arrived. A steady flow of animals glided below the station, whisking the zooplanktons toward their targets. The tiny creatures packed together so tightly that they formed a glowing slime, which began oozing into the engines. The propellers seemed unstoppable, but the zooplanktons kept coming. A never-ending stream of glowing sludge forced itself into the engines, whirling around the propellers, gumming them up, slowing them down, bringing them closer to the breaking point. Chapter 62 The New Arrivals. 2 small shapes were moving through the sky. As the shapes flew nearer, their details came into focus. They were birds. They were geese. They were Brightbill and Glimmer. The ancient shark's call to action had spread far and wide, and eventually it had reached Rose's Island. As soon as the geese heard the details, they took off. For 3 days they traveled over seas and islands and coastlines, and then they spotted the Juggernaut, floating on the waves of the Northern Ocean. The water was brimming with creatures, and the station was bristling with birds. But Brightbill and Glimmer ignored the other animals and concentrated on finding Roz. Soaring over the Juggernaut, they searched for any sign of the robot. She wasn't on the rooftops or the platforms or the walkways. She had to be in one of the buildings. The geese peered through window after window looking for Roz, but there were too many windows to check them all, so our friends asked for help. A flock of puffins pointed them to sandpipers, who pointed them to cormorants, who pointed them to the top of the control tower, where a seagull was sitting among a mass of broken antennas. The geese touched down beside the gull, and Brightbill said, "I was told you know where to find a robot named Roz." "You must be her son," said Nimbus, smiling. And then his expression sank. "I'm afraid your mother was captured. She's been in there since this morning." Nimbus motioned to one of the lower buildings. "What should we do?" said Glimmer. "We should go in after her," said Brightbill. "I think I can be of assistance," said Nimbus. Then the gull threw back his head and screeched, "Who wants to start some trouble?" A gang of spunky seabirds was quickly assembled, and everyone followed Nimbus down through the air. They swooped past structures and dodged other birds, and then landed by the building where Roz was being held. "I hope you know how to get in," said Nimbus, inspecting the closed door with his good eye. "As a matter of fact, I do," said Brightbill. The goose hopped up and packed a button on the wall, and like magic, the door slid open. The birds hurried inside and found a hallway lined with more closed doors. They began packing buttons, opening doors, exploring every room. They found machines and cabinets and equipment, but they didn't find any robots. So they fluttered up a stairwell and explored the next floor of the building. They went from room to room, from floor to floor, but there was no sign of Roz. Until they reached the top floor, the birds crept out from the stairwell and peeked around a corner. Down the hall, Bosun 10 was standing guard. Glimmer whispered, Ross must be in that room, Nimbus replied. Let us handle the guard. You and Bright Bill bust Ross out. The gull smiled. Then he strutted down the hall and squawked, Hey, blockhead, why don't you go swim with the fishes? Bosun Tan turned his blocky head to face the seagull. He didn't understand what the bird had said, of course, but he felt something like surprise at the sight of a gull strutting toward him. More surprises were on their way, and the other seabirds came flying around the corner. There were 4 puffins and 3 terns and 5 sandpipers. 2 skuas brought up the rear, their wings nearly spanning the width of the hall. The gang flapped and squawked and taunted the robot, luring him away from the jail room. He took the bait and chased them down the hall, and they all disappeared into the next stairwell. The geese raced over to where the robot had been standing. Bright Bill packed the button on the wall. He packed it again and again, but the door wouldn't open. Ma, are you in there? Said Bright Bill. Ross's face appeared in the door window. Bright Bill? Glimmer? What are you doing here? We're here to get you out, Ma. The guard is gone, but this door is locked. Leave that to me, said Ross. Bright Bill and Glimmer stood back. There was a loud clang, and another clang, and with the next clang, the door shot across the hall and fell to the floor. Then Ross stepped out and scooped the geese into her arms. We were so worried about you, Ma, said Bright Bill. We heard what was happening and thought you could use some help, said Glimmer. You were correct, said Ross. The robot and the geese talked quickly and quietly. Ross explained that they were on a mining station and that the poison tide was flowing from down on the seafloor. Bright Bill spoke about the island. Thanks to the supply of the fresh water, most animals were surviving, but food and shelter were scarce. Several more geese had left the flock. Neighbors were lashing out at each other. The island community had splintered apart. There is some good news, said Glimmer. Our goslings have hatched. That is wonderful, said Ross. I'm so happy for you both. But if you two are here, who is looking after your goslings? Good old Loudon is taking care of them while we're away, said Bright Bill. They'll be perfectly safe with her. As you know, reader, robots don't feel emotions, not the way animals do. But in that moment, even with all the trouble she was in, our robot felt something like joy to learn that she was a grandmother and that her son was a father. Chapter 63. The Chaos. The crew stared in disbelief at the chaos outside. Animals had taken over the sea and the sky. Whales were sending wave after mountainous wave crashing against the station, and mysteriously the water was glowing pale blue. George pulled Akiko aside and said, I think I was wrong about Ross. With your permission, I'll go ask if she can call off the animals. Before Akiko could reply, a warning flashed across her computer. Something was wrong with the engines. The crew had no idea that the engines were under attack by a vast swarm of zooplanktons. More of those tiny creatures kept joining the fight, and now a glowing sludge was thickening and hardening around the propellers. The engines strained and struggled. There was a terrible gnashing noise, and then each of the propellers ground to a halt. Without engines to stabilize it, the station started bobbing in the waves. Everyone aboard went flying. Bosons toppled over, Bright Bill and Glimmer fluttered away as Ross stumbled against the wall. Crew members fell out of their chairs and slid across the floor, grasping at anything that was bolted down. The station settled until it was gently swaying with the movement of the ocean. Then the humans burst into a panic. What is happening? Yelled the electrician. I didn't sign up for this, yelled the mechanic. How are we going to survive? Yelled the engineer. Stop yelling, yelled the station manager. Akiko took a deep breath and said, I've seen enough. We need to abandon the juggernaut. What about Ross? Said George. We don't have time for her, said Akiko. We have to get our crew off the station. The assistant manager snapped into action and shouted instructions to the crew. Let's put on our cold weather gear. Then we'll calmly take the stairs down to the launch pad and we'll board the airship together. The crew members pulled on their heavy boots and thick coats and warm hats and gloves, and they headed for the stairwell. but they stopped when they glanced out the window. You see, the juggernaut was slowly sinking, and as more waves rolled in, they started washing over the platforms and surging between buildings and pouring back into the sea. One wave slammed on boson against a stack of steel beams. Another wave smashed through doors and flooded into rooms and hallway. In the freezing temperatures, sheets of ice quickly formed, and Bosun 5 tumbled down a slippery flight of stairs. And then a wave went rolling toward the launch pad. Bosun 2 saw it coming. He tried to secure the airship, but he wasn't fast enough. The huge wave swept over, and when it had passed, the airship and the robot were gone. Water continued pouring through the gash in the station, flooding the lower compartments. There were pops of electricity. Fires crawled up the interior, setting off a series of explosions. Smoke billowed from air vents. Flames shot out from the windows. The juggernaut was ablaze and adrift. Chapter 64. The Leap. Roz and Brightbill and Glimmer were still in the hallway when they heard screeching and stomping, and then the seabirds came flapping around the corner. "Look, Roz is free!" "Great! Now let's take off! Move, move, move!" Close behind the seabirds was Bosun 10. He saw Roz standing outside her jail room, and his robotic voice boomed, "Stop, prisoner, stop!" Roz didn't stop. Instead, she and the birds scrambled away from Bosun 10, down the hall and into the stairwell. Thick smoke was rising from below, so they hurried upstairs and exited onto the roof. The seabirds scattered into the sky, but the robot and the geese couldn't stop staring at the chaos on the station. Broken equipment was strewn across the platforms. Clouds of smoke floated between buildings. Bosun sprayed jets of water at a roaring blaze, but the flames were too ferocious, and the robots were quickly engulfed. That's when Roz noticed the ocean. It was calm. The sea creatures had stopped thrashing. The whales had stopped making waves. The glowing haze of zooplankton had drifted off. Victory had soothed their anger, and the army of animals were pulling back to let the juggernaut sink into the sea. "The humans need my help," said Roz, looking up at the control room. "They might have caused the poison tide, but I will not leave them to die." Behind her, a robotic voice boomed, "Stop, prisoner, stop!" And there was Bosun 10 stepping out of the smoky stairwell. Brightbill and Glimmer took wing as Roz sprinted to the edge of the roof. The robot leaped high into the air, up toward the control room balcony, but the distance was a little too far. It looked like she would fall to the fires below. However, as she passed under the balcony, her long arms reached up, and with her fingertips she grabbed one of the support beams. Dangling, she turned her head and watched while Bosun 10 made the same leap. The industrial robot was bigger and stronger than Roz, but he was also heavier and slower. He launched up through the air, rising higher and higher, but not high enough. His bulky body crashed against the control tower and plunged down into the smoke and flames. With that, the last of Bosun robots were destroyed. Roz pulled herself onto the balcony. Brightbill and Glimmer landed nearby. Worried faces were staring at our friends through the control room windows. Akiko stepped outside, pointing a rifle. "Did you do this?" she yelled. "Did you order the attack?" "I tried to prevent the attack," said Roz, "but the animals were angry and out of control. If you had suffered as they have, you would understand." "Why are you here?" said Akiko. "What more do you want from us?" "I only want to get your crew to safety." Akiko grunted and lowered her weapon. "The airship is gone, and the life rafts are in flames. We're out of options." Roz made a few animal sounds to the geese, who nodded and flew away. Then the robot said to Akiko, "I can get everyone to safety, but I must carry each of you down to the main platform, one at a time. Who would like to go first?" Chapter 65. The Rescue. George nervously peered down from the balcony and said, "I'm going to trust you, Roz. I hope I don't regret this." "Do not worry, George. I will be very careful." Very carefully, Roz picked up the man. She held him securely, and then she leaped off the balcony. George screamed wildly as they plummeted toward a lower rooftop, but the robot's legs absorbed the impact, and the landing was surprisingly gentle. That wasn't so bad, said George with a smile. A moment later, he was screaming again as they leaped over a flaming wreckage and dropped to a safe corner of the main platform. I'll be right back, said Roz, helping the man to his feet. Then she leaped away, vanishing into the smoke-filled sky. She came flying back down a minute later, carrying Vivian, the technology manager. Then she brought down the engineer, and then the mechanic, and then the electrician, and finally the station manager. The crew members huddled together in the cold evening air, wondering what would happen next. Their eyes kept peeking over the edge of the platform. The station was slowly sinking, and the ocean surface was getting closer all the time. There was a sudden spray of mist, and everyone turned to see a pod of whale arriving. The whales breathed noisy gusts of air through their blowholes as they lined up along the platform. These are your life rafts, said Roz. You expect us to ride whales, said George. An hour ago, they wanted to kill us. The whales did not want to kill you, explained Roz. They wanted to stop the poison tide. Now they want to take you back to land. I have ridden on a whale myself. I promise they will keep you safe. With no other choice, the crew began climbing onto the whales. They crawled around blowholes and dorsal fins, and soon each human was sitting on the back of their very own whale. Despite what the humans had been through, they couldn't help feeling awestruck by those magnificent animals. When everyone was seated, Akiko looked up at Roz on the platform and said, I'm sorry to tell you this, but the poison tide is still flowing because the mining robot is still working, and he'll keep working until his task is complete. He is a giant machine designed to demolish deep-sea mountains. You can't stop him, Roz, and he won't take orders from you. Please go home. We'll send an entire fleet of cleanup robots to shut down the mining site and remove the poison tide from the ocean. It'll take time, but it'll get done. And I'll make sure the poison tide never happens again. You have my word. A deep groan rumbled up from the biggest whale. It was his way of saying, we should leave while the water is calm. So the whales pushed off and started ferrying the humans to shore.